So this Sunday, I'm starting a series on this particular letter, the letter of James, which holds a kind of dear place in my heart as a Christian. When I went to Trinity, my very first year at Trinity, Raymond Judd, the chaplain of the chapel there, started a Bible study. He had a habit of doing a Bible study on Saturday mornings up in the refectory, which is the dining hall there. And we gather our food and take our Bibles and we go into the refectory and we would sit and have a little Bible study at the hour of 7 o'clock in the morning, which, you know, is kind of an early time to be getting up when you're 18 and on your own for the first time, and you really can sleep in all you want to, but I was eager to learn. And Raymond Judd was a great teacher, and I loved going up to that place and studying this book. In fact, this book became very dear to me. It's one of the things that Raymond Judd said about it, a characteristic of James, is that he said it's like a string of pearls. And that's how he did it. String of pearls. Oh, sometimes he would do string of pearls. It was very dramatic, Raymond Judd. I got a little of that from him, I think. And what he meant by that is that the book of James is a bunch of contained little pieces. And the wonderful thing about that is that they're little chunks that you can grab and memorize. And so I memorized a whole lot of the book of James as I was trying to internalize it and make it my own. And some of the very first sermons that I ever preached as a student came out of this book as well. And so it holds a real dear place for me. Martin Luther didn't feel so fondly about it. Martin Luther, the reformer in the Reformation years, called it a right straw-y epistle and would have preferred that it not be included in the canon of the Bible, so he was ready to throw it in the trash. Mainly because, depending on how you read James, it sounds like James is all about doing and not about believing. But I'm convinced that what James is really about, which for Martin Luther was a problem, he was all about grace and not about works, because he'd been trapped in the doing things to try to earn God's favor place, and when he got liberated by grace, he was like wanting to stay there, and he had trouble figuring out how you integrate back in the works part, the doing, the embodying and the living out of your faith. James comes from the St. Francis line of our Christian tradition, which says, this is one of my favorite quotes from Francis, "Preach the gospel everywhere, at all times, wherever you are, preach the gospel. And if you absolutely must, use your words." Your life is to be the proclamation. The way you live in the world is to be the proclamation of God's life in you. Not what you blab, but what you do. And so James comes from that string, all right? But I want to take I'm going to take each chapter 2 Sundays. So we're going to do chapter 1 today and then next week, and then chapter 2 the next couple of Sundays. And we'll just unpack it a little bit at a time like that. But I want to take some time today to give you a little overview about James, to give you some parameters that can help you understand as you read ahead and read down through James yourself. The first is, who is James? Which is a good question, right? Who's the guy who wrote this? Well, in the New Testament, there are 2 Jameses that are spoken of. The first is James, the brother of John and the son of Zebedee. They had a fishing business together, and Jesus called James and John, who left their dad in the boat one day and went to follow Jesus. I'm sure that made him very happy. And so they became the sons of thunder. They had a bad reputation for talking before they thought and for causing problems, you know. But they were close to Jesus. They, together with Peter, were probably the type crew that hung out with Jesus most. When Jesus goes to the mountain and is transfigured, it's James, John, and Peter. When Jesus goes in to do a healing of a little girl, it's James, John, and Peter who go with him. But that's not this James. All right? That James was killed in 42 AD. He was martyred in 42 AD. This James is James, who's referred to as the brother of Jesus. Now, that's confusing for some folks because, at least in the Catholic tradition, the idea of Mary's perpetual virginity meant that Jesus had no brothers and sisters. But he's called James, the brother of Jesus. And so the Protestant tradition does not have any trouble with Mary having other kids. But the way that's understood in the Catholic tradition is that maybe he was a cousin who was raised like a brother and called a brother or something like that. But clear, he was a family member of Jesus' clan. And it really doesn't matter whether he was Mary's brother. It doesn't matter. Don't get hung up on that, please. He lived till 62 AD, which is an important date. Because in 60 AD, and this letter was likely written after, right near the end of his life, just before he was martyred by King Herod Agrippa. It was likely written after that because if we look at the greeting in this book, it says, James, a servant, literally slave of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in diaspora, or scattered among the nations. Now, in the year 60, what happened is the Roman army descended upon Jerusalem to squash a rebellion, a Jewish rebellion, and utterly destroyed Herod's temple, the temple that was used for the whole sacrificial system in Judaism, just like the Babylonians had done 700 years before. And the temple was ruined. It was torn down completely. And all the Jews in Jerusalem went, pew, like cockroaches, to every corner of the Roman Empire. And they were in diaspora. They were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. And so James, who was a leader, James the brother of Jesus, who was a leader in the Jerusalem community of believers, is sending a letter out to all of these folks who are all over the place because they've been scattered. All right? Now, the other thing I want to say about this is that we know from the book of Acts that James was not only a leader in the early Christian community in Jerusalem, but he was a leader of what we might call the conservative party of Christians, or the fundamentalist group of Christians. Because in the early years of the Christian community, when they began to spread out, and Paul, Silas, Barnabas, Mark started doing missionary journeys into Asia and Europe, they started bringing converts in who were Greeks and Romans and not Jews. And all of a sudden, there was this conflict that emerged. Well, how Jewish do they have to be before we can let them be Christian? Do they need, because Jesus was a Jew, right? And so don't you need to come in through that door before you can be a part of the Christian community? And there was a huge conflict. In Acts, it's described in one chapter of Acts where there was this huge conflict. Well, James was part of the conservative party that believed that you had to be Jewish before you could be Christian. He was at that stage of development when we talked about stages of faith a few weeks ago. He was a 3, law and order. He was at a 3. You got to do it this way. If you don't do it this way, you're out. By the time he writes this letter, he's opened up. By the time he writes this letter, he's got a very different and much more generous perspective about him. But that was the trajectory that he had to go through, just like a lot of us. You go through that law and order time where the rules and regs are absolutely important, and you can't break them. You have to obey every one, jot and tittle. Well, James eventually moves beyond that and comes to welcome and embrace a much more open understanding of Christian faith and how it can be lived out. But he retains that very important dimension that Christianity is not about what you think in your head, but it's about what you do with your life. St. Francis said, "You only know what you live. You only really know or understand what you live. I've told you all a number of times, the last thing I think many Christians need to do is go to a Bible study. What we need to do is live the Bible studies that we've already done. Because until we put it into our flesh, until it becomes a way of life with us, then we don't really understand it. James is a book that is all about putting it into the flesh. Get it into you. Make it part of you. Make it be who you are. And so as we walk through James, I hope you will listen to that sense and that understanding that he has about how we are to engage Christianity, the life of faith. It's to be a way of life, not just a set of doctrines that we believe in our heads or that we say yes to, but that have no effect upon how we live. All right? Now, I want to give a couple other parameters about James, because there are some other things that characterize this particular book that I think are interesting and are valuable to be aware of. There are 4 deep concerns that James has about the church. And it's important to recognize, unlike Paul's letters, all right, which were written to the church at Ephesus, or the church at Corinth, or the church at Thessalonica, or the church in Galatia, James is writing to everybody. And so different from Paul's letters, where he says, you know, I've heard that you guys are bickering about this and this and this is what I think you ought to... He's dealing with a very clear problem that's right in that community. Okay, it may not be true of Galatia, but it's true of Corinth. It may not be true of Thessalonica, but it's true of Galatia. Understand what I'm saying? It's a specific letter to a specific community. This is a general epistle. It's written to all these folks who are all over the place. So it doesn't pick up a specific issue about one particular community. He's talking about general things that he's observing that the church needs to be paying attention to. And there's 4 that come to mind, or that kind of sound out on numerous occasions in this letter. The first is the issue of partiality. Particularly, partiality toward the wealthy. Giving more attention to the folks with significant means, and less attention to the folks who are poor. Giving the guy who comes in with a really nice robe and some gold jewelry all over his hand the best seat in the house, and telling the poor to sit over here on the floor. All right? He's like, whoa, 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 whoa. God is the great leveler, and there is no distinction between rich and poor before God. And we, if we reflect that, should live that in the way we treat people. Second thing is the importance of charity, that is, love made concrete, especially charity toward the disadvantaged of various kinds. Charity as a fundamental core practice, not just an idea, but a practice in Christian life. The third is a powerful concern in various ways about the matter of self-control, about being autodominio. How do I maintain governance over my own self? Not other people, but my own self. Do I manage my tongue and my speech? Do I manage my behavior and my action? Do I manage what I do with my body in the world? Do I do that well? Am I living within some kind of self-control? The fourth thing that he brings up very often, is endurance during trials and difficulties. Now, you can imagine that that's an important thing for him, because he's talking to all the Jews who've just been utterly, squashed by the Roman Empire and who've been sent out, and there's a huge persecution and rounding up of the Jews that begins to take place in the Roman Empire. And so all the Christians are identified with the Jewish community, and so they are being rounded up too. And so there's a lot of persecution going on. There's a lot of hatred, a lot of violence, a lot of antagonism toward the Christian and Jewish communities. And so that's part of the reality. It's like, how do you deal with that? What is your posture to be in face of that? So those four things, partiality, charity, self-control, and how you deal with trials and tribulations, are four core concerns. There are other things he brings up, but he hits those on multiple occasions as we go through the book. So as you do that, just kind of be watching for what he has to say about those, because I don't know about you, but I know for me, those continue to be issues in our world today. Is that not part of what we're struggling with in our political system, which is being dominated by partiality toward the very wealthy, who basically fund the elections and get what they want in legislation? Is the issue of charity toward the disadvantaged not what we're dealing with as we struggle to find adequate resources as a nation for the poor, for the folks without homes, for the folks who need mental wellness care, for all manner of single moms who are struggling to be able to provide for themselves? Still issues today. Self-control? Nah, that's not an issue today, is it? I didn't think so. So, it's a very relevant book. It has a lot to say about real stuff that you and I are dealing with, and that our world is dealing with today. So I'm hopeful that you'll find it to be of interest to you. And the last thing I want to say just kind of generally about James, before we jump into this first chapter, is that he uses two teaching tools pretty significantly throughout this. The first is he uses metaphor. He uses metaphors to describe things. An example, at one point, he talks about the tongue being like the rudder on a boat. Very little, but it can move the whole boat in a good direction or a bad one, depending on how it's used. And do you have control of your rudder, basically, is what he asks. He uses a lot of other metaphors, but the other teaching tool he uses is to pose a question rhetorically, and then to answer that question with his own reflections on that. For example, he says, what good is it if you've got faith, but you don't have any works to make it visible? What good is that? That's a question. So then he proceeds to address that question. So question and answer, and the use of metaphor and image to try and teach something that he is trying to get across, or vehicles that he uses in his particular letter. So let's jump in to chapter 1, and we have very little time to do that, but I'm going to dive in real quick. I want to look at the very first piece. He starts out, he says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you are having problems. Did you hear that? Consider it pure joy whenever you're having problems. Well, that's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? I mean, is it pure joy when I win the lottery, or when I just get married, or when I've got a brand new house, or when my kids are making great grades in school? Is it that pure joy? No, pure joy is when you're going through problems. And you kind of go, what? Why? How? How can you understand that? Well, he says, here's the deal. The problems are what produce in you maturity. You don't grow in the same way from all the good times. You grow when you have to face the difficulties in life. That's when you find out what you're made of. That's when you find out also what you're not made of, and where you need to do some work. It's the problems in life that reveal to us the places that we need to work on. The relational issues, the problems in our physical care for ourselves, the problems in our relationships with coworkers, the struggles that we have in trying to engage in self-control. Those are the problems, the persecutions that come from the outside. All of that stuff is what gives us the opportunity to grow and to learn. He's whistling up there. So, count it all joy when you encounter trials and struggles and tribulations, because God is working to mature you through those. Anthony DeMello is very good on this point. Anthony DeMello talks about trials and tribulations, problems in our lives, helping to reveal three things to us that are getting in our way of being able to be happy. Beliefs that we hold on to that we need to let go of. Attachments that we have to things or to people or to ideas or to desires that we have. And fears that we have about what might happen or what we might lose or what might come in the future. Beliefs, attachments, and fears. Problems in our lives bring to the fore our beliefs, attachments, and fears that are in the way of us being able to be happy. So he goes from there to say, so, if any of you lacks wisdom, the ability to see clearly what you need to see about yourself, ask God for it. Ask God for that wisdom. Ask God to reveal to you what you need to learn. Because James understands very clearly that there's really only one person you can work on. And it's not your spouse. Or your kids. Or your boss. Or your brothers and sisters. There's only one person that you have any capacity to really transform. And that's you. And you're the only one who can do that work. There ain't nobody else who's going to do it for you. But if you want to do that work, God's willing to be your companion. God's willing to send you wisdom. I love this next line. Whoops, where'd it go? There we go. If any of you lacks wisdom, ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. Listen to that. If any of you needs wisdom, ask God, who gives wisdom generously to everyone without finding fault. This is not a book about judgment and condemnation. This is a book about helping you discover how you can become the best, most whole, most complete person that God can possibly make you. That's the goal. The goal is to become complete. Here it is. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may become mature and complete, lacking nothing. Whole is the idea. That you can be whole, integrated, incorporating all of the truth about yourself, not being blind to pieces of yourself you'd rather hide from or wish were not there, but whole, complete, full. So the wisdom that God wants to give us, God offers freely, without judgment. But, he says, don't doubt in your asking for it. Now, a few weeks ago, I talked very passionately about how doubt is not a bad thing, right? Doubt often is what opens us up to take the next step of faith that we need to take in our lives. And that is still true. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about doubting God or doubting something that you've inherited as a belief system. We're not talking about that. We're talking about doubting whether or not God's willing to send you wisdom. God is willing to send you wisdom. If you don't believe that God wants to help you, if you don't believe God can reach you with what you need to hear, then you're not going to hear it. If your eyes are closed, you won't be able to see. If your ears are plugged, you won't be able to hear. If your heart is hard, you're not going to be able to be open to it. But if you are open, if you trust that God wants to walk with you through your problems to help teach you how to be a better you, then God will do that. Don't doubt it. God will offer that. In the Asian wisdom traditions, there's a wonderful proverb. It's, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. When the student is ready, the teacher appears. It's all about my readiness. It's not about whether the right person's there. It's about my readiness to listen, to receive, and to welcome what's there. Because, honestly, the teachers are all around me. They're the kids at Peace Camp. They're my parents. They're my neighbor who is doing this thing that I just can't stand. Or that church member who's always bragging about the same thing. Those are my teachers. If the student is ready. But the student has to be ready. And when you are, the teacher will come and will reveal to you those areas that you can work on. He continues. He says, the brother in humble circumstances ought to take pride in his high position, the one who is rich in his low position, because basically rich people, you're going to die and you can't take anything with you. That's what he says. God is, as the prophets say over and over again, the one who brings the mountains down and lifts the valleys up, the one who makes all of us on equal footing. And it's important for us to grow into an understanding that that is exactly the way it is. We are all equal before God. Thank God our Supreme Court affirmed some of that just this week. But what a struggle it's been. What a struggle to be able to say what we have here. Well, then he goes on to say, and this piece is really very, very interesting. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting, because God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does God tempt anyone. All right? So, listen up. Temptation is not out there. It's not that guy who looks like that, or that girl who wears that thing, or that advertisement that they're putting in front of me on the television. It's not, temptation is not out there. What does he say? It's the desires in me that rise up and make a problem for me. So where's the battle? Where's the battle to be fought? Is it out there blaming other people for what they're doing that's making my life a problem? No. Right here. This is the only place to look. Because this is where the real battle lies. This is where the challenge is. And that is deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition of wisdom and mysticism, as it is deeply rooted in the Christian tradition of mysticism and wisdom, and the Asian traditions of mysticism and wisdom. God dwells in you and will help you do battle, but you need to understand where the battle is to be fought, because so many of us, James included, fought the battle out there, believing that somehow, if they changed, things would be better. Only to discover that right here is where the work needs to be done. So, grab a hold of the steering wheel or whatever, and of the car, and let's jump on to James's roller coaster and discover some of the things he's got for us to learn and grow into, and invite us to the kind of work on self that enables us to become mature and whole, and able to reflect in the world all that God desires us to be. Let us pray. Amoroso Dios, gracias por nuestro hermano Santiago y la oportunidad de escuchar su sabiduría. Ayúdanos a escucharlo no con un oído que desea, un corazón que desea juzgar, ni a nosotros mismos, sino como Dios que da sabiduría sin juzgar. Ayúdanos a recibir la sabiduría que necesitamos sin juzgar y con la intención de transformar. En el nombre de Cristo Jesús te lo pedimos.